The file that carried her name was thinner than it should have been. In the archives of the Reich Security main office, where even the smallest railway clerk had a folder thicker than a Bible, hers contained only 6 pages. No photograph, no birthplace, not even a reliable age. Just a notation written in red pencil, remove from record when possible. That sentence, more than any medal or headline, explained who she was. She arrived in Europe the way most Americans did in 1943, by sea, smelling of coal smoke and nervous hope. The newspapers back home spoke of liberation and destiny, but the docks of Liverpool offered only rain and tired men unloading crates marked with numbers instead of names. She was registered as a translator attached to a medical unit, a believable cover. Her German was clean, learned from a mother who never stopped speaking of the old country she had fled. What the forms did not mention was that she could listen without being noticed and remember without writing anything down. In those months the war had begun to tilt, though no one standing in the mud could feel it. The Nazis still controlled the continent like a clenched fist. Trains ran on time, prisons were full, and every town square had a portrait of Hitler watching the pigeons. To survive, people learned to speak in layers. A sentence could mean 3 different things depending on who was listening. She learned this quickly. It was the first real lesson Europe taught her. Her work began with ordinary tasks. She interpreted for doctors treating French dockworkers crushed by crates, for Belgian children burned by faulty heaters, for German prisoners who claimed they had only cooked soup and never fired a rifle. She listened more than she spoke. Patterns emerged the way shapes appear in fog, slowly, then all at once. Names repeated. Train schedules overlapped with rumors of new units moving west. The Americans collecting intelligence liked men who boasted. She preferred the ones who were afraid. The first time her reports reached higher desks, she did not know it. A colonel she never met read 3 pages she had typed and underlined 1 sentence. The clerk in Bremen counts ammunition by train wheels, not by crates. It sounded trivial until someone checked and discovered that an entire armored division had been moved without appearing on any official list. After that, more questions were brought to her table, usually folded inside medical forms so that even the typists would not be curious. She was not a soldier in the way Hollywood later imagined. She did not carry a pistol in her handbag or practice shooting bottles behind the barracks. Her weapons were timetables, overheard arguments, the hesitation in a man's voice when he lied about his unit. She dressed plainly, the way women who wish to be ignored always do. In photographs from those years, few survived. She looks like any nurse walking home after a long shift, shoulders slightly bent, eyes already thinking about tomorrow. The Nazis first noticed her without knowing they had noticed her. A counterintelligence officer in Hamburg wrote a report about an unidentified American female moving between medical and transport circles. He suggested surveillance, but added that she appeared insignificant. The word saved her life. The machinery of the Reich was designed to crush obvious threats. It often overlooked quiet ones. By 1944, her information was reaching London in envelopes that smelled of disinfectant. She never saw the maps that changed because of her notes, the bombing routes altered by a single remark she had caught in a railway canteen. History moves like that, through small hinges rather than grand doors. She remained unaware of her own weight. The incident that placed her name on Hitler's desk began with a funeral. A German major died of pneumonia in a hospital where she interpreted. His widow arrived carrying a suitcase too heavy for morning clothes. Inside were letters he had never mailed, filled with complaints about a new fuel depot being built near the Dutch border. The widow wanted them translated so she could understand the life she had married. The hospital refused. She asked the American woman instead. Those letters described more than a depot. They spoke of underground storage, of trains arriving at night without paperwork, of engineers from Peenemünde visiting in civilian coats. She copied nothing, yet remembered everything. When she passed the information to her contact, a British officer who pretended to be interested in church architecture, the Allied command realized they had stumbled onto a project larger than any ordinary supply base. From that moment, the thin file in Berlin began to grow. Intercepted messages mentioned a woman whose questions were uncomfortably precise. A Gestapo captain suggested arrest. Another advised patience, arguing that an open move might reveal how little they actually knew about her. The debate traveled up the chain like smoke through a building. She felt none of this directly. Her days remained filled with bandages and ration cards, yet the streets around her grew sharper, as if the city had developed edges. Men who once chatted freely now watched their own words fall to the ground before speaking. She sensed she was being observed the way animals sense weather, without proof. In September, she was asked to accompany a convoy toward the Belgian border. Officially, she would help with civilian refugees. Unofficially, she was to confirm the location of the fuel depot described in the dead major's letters. The road was crowded with retreating German units and farmers pushing carts piled higher than their roofs. She wrote in a small notebook about the color of the fields, because writing about anything else would have been dangerous. That journey ended before the town of Meppen, where a bridge had been destroyed by Allied aircraft. While the engineers argued, she walked among the stranded vehicles and listened. A sergeant complained that his trucks had been diverted from the new reserve near the canal. The phrase was casual, almost meaningless, yet it matched the letters exactly. She returned to the convoy with mud on her shoes and certainty in her mind. 2 weeks later, bombers struck the site. The explosion burned for 3 days and could be seen from the Dutch coast. Berlin demanded answers. The investigation concluded that security had been fatally compromised by unknown foreign influence. It was then that someone wrote, in careful bureaucratic German, the line that would follow her for the rest of the war. This woman must be removed from all documents. Orders in the Reich often traveled faster than understanding. The instruction to erase her presence reached offices that had never heard her name. Clerks crossed out references without asking why, assuming it was another routine adjustment in a bureaucracy that breathed paper. Yet erasing a person who was still moving through the world proved more complicated than scratching ink from a ledger. She spent that winter in Brussels, officially attached to a relief organization feeding children whose fathers were on the wrong side of the front. The city was a chessboard of loyalties. In one cafe, resistance couriers whispered over weak coffee. In another, German officers played cards as if the war were a rumor invented by foreigners. She learned to cross the square differently depending on which door she intended to enter. Her new assignment sounded harmless: interview railway workers about missing shipments of medicine. In truth, the Allies wanted to map the arteries through which the German army was bleeding supplies. She carried a canvas bag filled with forms that asked innocent questions. How many wagons? What time of day? Which platform? The answers, combined, drew a picture no single man could see. The Gestapo officer tasked with finding her imagined a spy out of cheap novels. He looked for a glamorous American with painted lips and expensive shoes. Instead, his agents reported a tired interpreter who ate alone and attended church irregularly. He began to suspect that the dangerous woman described in the files did not exist at all, only a misunderstanding multiplied by nervous superiors. Then a conductor in Liege mentioned her name during an interrogation about stolen coal. He remembered a woman who had asked about night schedules and the sound different locomotives made. The officer felt the first true spark of pursuit. He ordered discreet surveillance, unaware that 2 different resistance groups were already watching him. The city tightened around her like a coat pulled too small. Friends warned that strangers had inquired about an American translator. She changed rooms twice and learned to recognize the same bicycle appearing at different corners. Fear, when it arrived, did not feel dramatic. It felt like a headache that refused to leave. Despite this, she continued working. A network of informants had begun to trust her, precisely because she never promised miracles. A station master confessed that trains marked as agricultural were carrying crates too heavy for potatoes. A typist admitted she had typed manifests in triplicate for units that officially did not exist. Each fragment added another stitch to the hidden uniform of the enemy. In February 1945, the Germans launched their last desperate movements through Belgium, trying to delay the inevitable. Chaos, which usually hides truth, sometimes reveals it instead. She discovered that several medical trains were in fact transporting components for new rockets. The information reached Allied command hours before a planned interception. When the trains were destroyed near Aachen, Berlin concluded that a precise leak was operating inside their territory. The order to eliminate the source was signed without flourish. No name appeared, only a description: the American woman associated with transport inquiries. The machinery of death required little more. A team was dispatched, composed of men who preferred night work and left no reports. She might have vanished then like so many others if not for a small decision made months earlier. The British officer who had first received her notes insisted on meeting her again, arguing that the pattern of intelligence depended on a single mind. The rendezvous was scheduled in a bookstore whose owner collected rare maps. While they spoke among shelves smelling of dust, a resistance courier burst in with news of the approaching team. There was no chase through alleys, only a hurried walk to a cellar door and a truck already warming its engine. War rarely grants the elegance of cinema. She left Brussels with one suitcase and the feeling that the city had quietly exhaled her. From that moment, her life existed between borders. She was moved through safe houses like a parcel whose value was understood but never discussed. The Allies debated sending her home, yet every commander who read her analyses argued that she was worth more in Europe. The decision kept her on the continent and, unknowingly, kept the hunters' clothes behind. By April, the Reich was collapsing, but wounded animals can be most dangerous when cornered. Files were burned in courtyards across Germany. Among them were the remaining references to the woman who had embarrassed the system. Hitler himself demanded that the American instigator be found before the end, a final gesture of control in a world already slipping away. She crossed the Rhine with advancing troops, pretending to be another aid worker among thousands. Towns appeared like ghosts, windows staring without glass. People spoke in whispers not out of fear of the Nazis, but of the uncertain tomorrow. In this landscape, her anonymity became both shield and prison. The last message she delivered before Berlin fell concerned a laboratory hidden in a schoolhouse near Magdeburg. Scientists were destroying equipment while pretending to teach arithmetic to children. The report allowed Allied units to arrive in time to preserve documents that later shaped the early space program. Her contribution was noted in margins that would soon be classified for decades. When the war in Europe ended, she expected to fade back into ordinary life. Instead, officers arrived with questions that sounded like accusations. How had she known so much? Who were her contacts? She answered patiently, aware that victory breeds its own suspicions. Eventually, they thanked her and suggested she forget everything she had done. For the clerks tasked with cleaning the archives, forgetting became literal. They searched for the thin file marked with red pencil and found almost nothing left to remove. The woman had slipped through the paperwork as she had through the war, lightly, leaving few footprints. Peace did not resemble the word printed in newspapers. It smelled of wet bricks and displaced families. She worked for a time with agencies trying to reunite children with parents who no longer had addresses. The skills that once served espionage now helped decipher birth certificates and fatting photographs. Yet shadows from the previous years followed her. Former Gestapo officers, suddenly claiming to be simple policemen, recognized her in corridors and looked away too quickly. American investigators asked whether she wished to testify at trials. She declined, saying she had seen enough rooms where men explained why they were not responsible. One afternoon in 1946, she was summoned to a building that still bore bullet scars around the doorway. Inside, a U.S. major presented a box of recovered German documents. Among them was a memorandum ordering the erasure of her name. The major seemed pleased, as if handing her a trophy. She felt instead an odd fatigue, realizing that strangers had debated her existence like accountants arguing over a missing coin. The memorandum revealed how close she had come to disappearance. It listed train times she had taken, cafes she preferred, even the church where she sometimes lit candles without believing in saints. Reading it was like discovering a second life lived beside her own. She returned to America later that year. The ship crossing the Atlantic carried brides of soldiers and crates of machinery captured from laboratories. She stood at the rail watching Europe shrink, uncertain whether she was leaving home or merely another station. Back in the States, no parade waited. She found work in a library, cataloging foreign newspapers that smelled of the same dust as the archives she had once haunted. Neighbors asked polite questions about her time abroad. She answered with stories of ration lines and rain. The truth seemed too heavy for living rooms. Occasionally, letters arrived from men who remembered her differently. A Belgian conductor thanked her for saving his brother. A British officer wrote about the rockets intercepted because of her warning. She kept the letters in a drawer but never displayed them. The government contacted her only once more, requesting a statement for internal history. The interviewer, a young academic, asked whether she considered herself a hero. She replied that she had merely paid attention while others were busy shouting. Years passed. The world rushed toward new fears and new wars. Her file, what remained of it, was sealed under regulations meant to protect methods rather than people. To the public she became a rumor, a footnote occasionally mentioned in memoirs that could not quite recall her name. In old age, she watched documentaries that simplified everything into bold arrows on maps. None mentioned the woman who asked too many questions in railway canteens. She felt neither pride nor bitterness, only curiosity about how stories choose their survivors. The final chapter of her history began long after she stopped thinking of herself as part of it. In the 1990s, a researcher tracing the origins of Allied intelligence stumbled upon contradictory references. An unnamed American woman, a translator, a civilian asset. The puzzle led to declassified boxes where the red-penciled order still slept. The researcher visited her small apartment overlooking a river that had never seen war. She was surprised to discover the subject alive, more amused than cautious. They spoke for hours about ordinary things before approaching the past, as if it were a fragile guest. She described how information truly moved, not through secret gadgets but through tired people willing to talk. She insisted that chance, more than bravery, had guided her steps. The researcher listened, realizing that history prefers clear heroes while reality offers only complicated witnesses. When the book eventually appeared, reviewers searched for drama and found instead a quiet account of listening. Some doubted the story because it lacked explosions. Others sensed that this very restraint proved its authenticity. The title echoed the old memorandum, "The Woman Removed from Nazi Documents." She attended one lecture about the book and sat in the back row, embarrassed by applause meant for a version of herself she barely recognized. A student asked what lesson her life offered. After a long pause, she answered that tyranny depends on people not paying attention. Not long before her death, she received copies of the remaining German files. Most pages were blank where her name should have been. She kept them anyway, proof that absence can speak as loudly as ink. Her grave, in a modest cemetery, lists only dates and family relations. No mention of Europe, of trains, of the nights when a question could change the course of armies. Yet somewhere in the vast machinery of history, the gap she left behind continues to shape the record. And that is perhaps why they tried to erase her, not because she carried a weapon, but because she carried memory. In a system built on lies, remembering becomes an act of rebellion. The Nazis understood this too late, and by then the quiet American woman had already written her invisible signature across the map of a falling empire.